I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Please subscribe to my channel. I never say that, and you guys have done a good job of actually subscribing to it anyway. But yeah, like, please subscribe to my channel and also check out the Maurin Academy. I'm the president of the Maurin Academy. We offer classes, reading groups, live and recorded. We have a great newsletter that's free to everybody. We have a Patreon where you can get a lot of what we do. So I'll put all that in the notes below. So this is part 2 of my short series. Maybe it won't be too short, but on Federalist Papers 10 and 51. The Federalist Papers, just as a reminder, were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in support of the new Constitution, which they proposed to replace the Articles of Confederation with. It's the Constitution that we have in the United States today. And the reason I'm doing this is because I just think that people should know the reasoning behind the U.S. Constitution. Not that I'm like 100% an admirer of the U.S. Constitution, but especially if you are one, then it's good to know what's going on within it. So we had gotten to the point in the argument where James Madison, who wrote Federalist 10, had said that we just really can't get rid of the causes of faction. The causes of faction, if we got rid of them, if we got rid of the cause of divisions, in other words, political divisions, we would have to get rid of liberty or freedom itself. And then that would, of course, mean the end of the democratic experiment. And that, he said, was worse than the problem of faction. So he concludes that, and that's what we did last week. So then he says the inference, just to sum up, the inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. So the rest of this Federalist 10 is going to be about controlling the effects of factions. How possible is it? What kind of measures can the government take to try to control it so that the divisions or the factions, the groups within society, whether they are the majority or minority, don't cause so much disorder as to break apart the union? So he says, first, if a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, small r Republican, meaning rule by the people, the type of government that we have. Relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. Okay, so here he's just saying if it's a minority opinion, right, that is pushing against the majority, there is a remedy, which is just that we have a democracy of sorts, and people can vote, and they can basically, the majority will vote against the minority position. He says it may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. So it may do some harm, a minority faction. That's what he means by convulse the society. It may upset people, there may be conflict, but it will not be able to do its work through the government, is what he's saying there. It won't be able to do its violence, mask its violence through the government, because it won't rule the government. When a majority, though, he says, is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. So here again, he is saying there is such a thing as a majority faction. The faction has a ruling passion, which it does not share with other members of the society, but it is the majority, so it can gain the Constitution. It can actually, rule the government. Okay. And so this is more of a danger. So he says, to secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. He's saying, because it is so dangerous to have a majority who rules the government with a passion or interest that's not good for the rest of the citizens, and is about, in fact, limiting their rights, right? This is the great object, the great subject, in other words, that he should address most of his time to. And he says, let me add that it is the great desideratum by which this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. Desideratum, what a word. It means basically need. And what he's saying in this sentence is that most of the, quote, opprobrium, most of the criticism that democratic governments have had aimed at them for all time has been exactly this, that the majority can basically trample on the rights of the minority, whether it's a minority consisting of wealthy people and the majority consisting of poor people, or some other type of majority. In ancient times, which is what he's alluding to here, in the ancient Athenian democracy, which has loomed so large throughout actually the Federalist Papers, we learn the lesson from their experience that a lot of times democracies just become rule of the majority of poor people, and then they actually try to take the property, all the property from the wealthy, and trample upon their rights. Okay, but that is the ancient concern, and it could still be a concern today, but this statement would apply to anything, any situation where the majority actually wants to impose upon everyone else something that they don't want. Might be a religion, the founders were very concerned about that as well, to not have religion imposed, a particular kind of religion imposed upon everybody, regardless of whether they wanted it, because they thought there was such a thing as the right to worship as you choose, or even not to worship at all. All right, so this is the problem that democracies have, and he's saying here, if we can solve this problem, then a lot of that opprobrium, that bad reputation that democracies have will go away. So then he says, by what means is this object obtainable? How can we do this? How can we protect the system from the majority trampling on everybody else and their rights? He says, evidently by one of two ways only. Okay. First way, either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority having such coexistent passion or interest must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. Okay, let's break this down. So the first thing has to do with the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented. So that means the first option is we just need to somehow not allow the majority to get to that state, right, where it's got this supreme passion shared by that number of people. Okay. And then the other one is, she says, the majority having such coexistent passion. So if we're talking about a majority that does indeed have a singular passion or interest that it wants to pursue, they must be rendered by their number or local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. So in this, he's saying somehow you would have to find a way to not allow them to prevent them from collaborating to such an extent that they would be able to carry into effect their schemes of oppression. Okay. And then he says, if the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as adequate control. No truer words have ever been said, right? If the factious dominating impulse to dominate others that are not members of the majority, if we allow that impulse to exist and it has full opportunity to play itself out through the government, then there's no morality or religious system, belief system in the world that will be able to hold that majority back. And it's kind of interesting that we now see like a Christian element in our current situation. It's really quite big, right? And obviously the Christian religion is not holding this impulse back. So we see that he's correct about that. All right, then he says, they are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals and lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together, that is, in proportion as their efficacy becomes needful. Religion and morality cannot really stand up to the injustice and violence of individuals in such a situation. And the bigger the majority, the less morality and religion will stop people, because that involves like a interior belief system that's strong enough. And he understands that the bigger the group, the more your individual moral impulses are dampened. Like they knew it back then, we know it now even more so through the study of psychology. When you're in a mass and in a crowd and it's violent in particular, or it's rioting, people just turn off their individual rationality as well as their morality. It's instinctual almost. So he knew it back then. All right, then Madison says, from this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. And actually, this is, like Athens would have been considered a pure democracy. And the way that the founders would have thought of democracy is that it would have to be fairly small, a pure democracy, by which they would have imagined something like what Athens had, where every citizen voted on every issue. It wasn't a representative democracy, it was a direct democracy in which every citizen voted on every issue. So it would have to be a small number of people, okay? And so he's saying in a situation like that, there's almost no way that a faction isn't going to form, especially a majority faction, and then it's not going to be stopped by morality or religion. He says a common passion or interest will in almost every case be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication in concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Direct democracies like Athens were very prone to the majority running over the minority, or they were prone to having a, quote, obnoxious individual, that would be a demagogue, somebody who used political speech and reputation to basically overwhelm and gain the like loyalty of the vast majority. And then that demagogue could do whatever he wants. So he's really tapping into ancient history here. He says, hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretical politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. So no need to belabor this, but he's saying, anybody, any theorist or politician who thinks that this is possible is just mistaken. It's always going to end with demagogues, basically petty tyrants ruling it, people giving up their democratic, foundations to dictators and so on. But Madison's trying to say this new modern Republican form of government that we're proposing in this new Constitution is somehow going to get around the problems that the ancient democracies that they all knew about had. One of the more confusing things about Federalist Papers is these guys were writing like everybody knew ancient history. And even like the average person who was literate knew something about ancient history, I think, because they got it even in grade school, honestly. If you take a look at the grade school books, almost everybody back in the early days of America, if they had schooling, did know something about it. And particularly people who were well-read would have. Whereas today, a lot of people reading this for the first time, they don't know what he's talking about. So that's what he's talking about. And he's saying, we have a modern way, a political science, a type of political science, modern political science, that we think can overcome these things by constructing a constitution the right way. We can overcome the dangers of the majority faction, at least to a certain extent. He's never going to be like 100%, confident. All right, then Madison says, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, as opposed to direct democracy. A scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect, and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. Okay, so I'm going to tell you how the union can be effective, how we can cure the democratic problems of old. Okay, he says then, the two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, one, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest, and two, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. So a republic is a representational form of government. That's what we have in the United States. We elect representatives. And it says that in the first point, we delegate the government to the representatives. Very fancy language, but that's what he means by a small number of citizens, right? They are citizens like us. We say, you go to Washington and you represent us. And then secondly, a cure for the problems of democracy also lies in the fact that if you do it this way, where you elect that smaller number of people to represent you, then you can extend this liberal democracy, this Republican form of government, over a much larger area. Because if you have a pure democracy, by necessity, it's small. You have all the citizens have to come together in an assembly. They're not going to want to be traveling for days. And not only that, but there's just a certain point beyond which these citizens couldn't even talk to each other and actually make decent decisions based on their deliberation. So it has to be small. But if you elect representatives and they go to, in this case, Washington, to, deliberate with each other, you kind of create the atmosphere of the small democracy through the representatives there in the legislature. And each of them represents a lot of people. So now the country can be much bigger. And there's something about the bigness of the country, right? The fact that the rule can be extended across a much larger area, which Madison thought would make it less likely for majority factions to form. Okay. And this is kind of a spoiler in a way, but I think I'm coming to about the end of the time that I have to spend today, and we'll deal with this more next time. But the bigger the territory, the more the ways of life vary in different places. What is grown or manufactured vary a whole lot. Cultural differences can occur. And so all of this commercial, geographical, cultural diversity that you can get in a much larger country is exactly what you need to try to stop a majority faction that all share the same passion from taking place. Okay, so with that, I will end for today. And hopefully this has been helpful. Again, I know that the language in these Federalist papers is well nigh impossible for people to read for a lot of different reasons. I know my students have trouble with it. So I hope this is helpful. And I will continue. I may do 1 or 2, depending upon just how long I think I need to take to really explain the concepts and the verbiage in Federalist 10. All right. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week, hopefully.